name is Kennedy, and you're a Republican, and you're on MTV? Yeah. What?
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason. Thank you for coming. Today for lunch we're going to be interviewing MTV's Kennedy. She has not worked at MTV since the second Clinton administration, but as we were discussing at lunch, she will always be called MTV's Kennedy for the rest of her life. You've got a fan already, but Kennedy was one of the great faces of 90s alternative culture, not simply because she was a high-profile personality on MTV and a variety of other shows, and then later, before and later radio shows, but she was alternative in a way that was not fully appreciated in the 90s, a great decade of alternatives, which is that she was a non-democratic, fawning liberal in the media, particularly among youth culture, which marked her as pretty much one of a kind, perhaps almost as much as her turban today marks her as one of a kind. It's not chemotherapy, right? Let's get that out.
Okay, I promised Nick a turban in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
We spoke before we came to this.
So that's one more thing off my bucket list. But
he'll be wearing it by the end of the interview.
Yeah, what we are, and what's interesting is that you'll never see it leave her head until it's on mine. It's quite a trick. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about Kennedy's adventures as a radio personality, as a TV personality, and also as one of the highest profile libertarians, particularly on the West Coast. And I want to make sure that I get your current gig correct, because I always forget the call letters of your radio station now.
KYSR. It's 98.7 FM. For those of you who live in Los Angeles. Music in the morning. Woo.
With Kennedy. With Music in the Morning with MTV's Kennedy?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's good.
It's Clear Channel. It's not Viacom. So.
Okay. So it's a big fight. But well, let's talk about at MTV you became known kind of as the House Republican. I mean, you were out there. You were having fun. You were indistinguishable from the other correspondents and other faces on MTV, except for this one glare. I mean, you were distinguishable in that you had a lot of energy and you were actually funny, but you were, the same as everybody else, except you were a Republican. How did that come to public knowledge? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting because when I was at K-Rock, which is now my competitor in LA, which is where I got my start in broadcasting, I was an intern and then a DJ, which was great because I would do overnights. And on these overnight radio shows, I would write poems. And so I had a poetry corner, and a common theme in my poems was my love for Dan Quayle, of course. And so I had publicly proclaimed that. And I was also working as an intern on the morning show. And they were always delighted by my Republican leaning. So I never knew that it was a bad thing. I didn't realize there was an entire group of people out there.
Can you recite any of the Quayle sonnets from memory? Or
they're not suitable for this demographic, unfortunately. And now that I'm married, I don't feel that it's appropriate to make those proclamations in front of so many kind faces. But so Kevin Bean sent me to Little Saigon, where the Vice President was visiting, and I asked the last question during the press conference, which was, Mr. Vice President, how do I look in purple? And he paused for a second, and he said, you look great in purple. And it infuriated all of the political journalists in Southern California, and they were offended that their questions were not taken. And I saw that as a minor victory, and I realized that this was really a way to upset people. And
well, and then flash forward, you were covering the Clinton administration.
No, I was never allowed in the MTV studio when either Bill Clinton or Al Gore as candidates or as.
But you were at the inauguration.
Yes.
You were part of the coverage, and that's when your Republican leanings, deeply closeted, were thrust into public view by what process?
Well, it was interesting because the 1993 inauguration was the most star-studded party I'd ever been to. It was as though Etta James at last was being played from every monument at full volume. People were so excited to have a Democrat in the White House, especially MTV. They were really emotionally and politically invested in this candidate because Bill Clinton's candidacy put MTV News and Tabitha Soren on the map because he was the first person who ran for president who was really ready to play ball and saw the power of MTV.
And because Al and Tipper Gore had such a tight relationship with popular music. And,
that was conveniently glossed over. That was never mentioned.
But it was a huge generational shift. He was the first rock and roll president.
Yes, and so MTV embraced him and he embraced them right back. And there was something like 18 balls that night. Yeah. And so on MTV threw this gala, and I'm not lying to you, it was literally like it was like Tom Brokaw talking to Robert De Niro, and there was Sarah Jessica Parker and Matthew Broderick, and Bono's over here, and Jack Nicholson, and it was crazy. My head was just spinning, and I was so excited because John McLaughlin was there. And so, and he brought Martha Stewart as a date, and so he found Lloyd Grove, who at the time was a columnist for the Washington Post, and he was like, Lloyd, Martha Stewart is my date tonight. Lloyd, I brought her this evening, and Martha Stewart was looking, in 1993, she was looking good, okay? So that was a big catch.
Jail, and prison hardens a woman.
This was so pre-prison, yeah. So I was like, I'm a Republican. And I was wearing this beautiful Pamela Dennis red studded floor-length column gown. It was the nicest dress that I'd ever been in my life. It was worth thousands of dollars, and I had armed security to make sure I didn't soil it. And red suede Chanel platform shoes, and so I lifted up my dress in the middle of the thing, and Matthew Broderick, and I remember his eyes, and I'm like, oh, Ferris Bueller, and his eyes got so big, and I showed him
you were no doubt showing him something he had never seen before.
My Republican tattoo, yeah. So I had gotten a Republican tattoo when I was 18 that Nick conveniently pointed out last night, looks like a pig.
That's what 2 children will do to a person, right?
Yeah, clearly. Okay, but see, that doesn't make any sense because the tattoo wouldn't shrink. You're such a misogynist.
Yes,
so anyhow.
But only towards women.
It's actually, Leandro will tell you a different story. Anyhow, Lloyd Grove ended up, he didn't write about Martha Stewart. He wrote about the woman in the red dress from MTV who lifted it up and embarrassed John McLaughlin. And then John McLaughlin told the story on The Tonight Show. And then I was invited on The Tonight Show and told the story. And then I was in Vanity Fair. And Lloyd Grove wrote an article about me in Vanity Fair. And it was too much of a mind warp for MTV. Wait a second, man, your name is Kennedy, and you're a Republican, and you're on MTV? Yeah. What?
So, and then your later, so that became part of your persona, really, is that you were like a right-wing chick on MTV.
Yeah, and it's not something that I talked about too much on air, but there were times when if I was interviewing bands, and a couple of the bands that I remember, one was Marilyn Manson, and the other was Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine. And for those of you who know Rage Against the Machine's music, there's no column far enough left. I mean, they actually almost circle all the way around to being Callista Gingrich. Like, that's how liberal they are. It's impressive. And Tom Morello made a snide comment about me being a Republican, and I kind of got into it with him about, open markets, and he did not like that at all, because they actually in some of their one of their CDs they have a list of books, like a photograph of book spines, and presumably like, okay, simpletons, this is what you should be reading. Here is your education, not only in music but in life. Go. I always thought that was so condescending.
There wasn't a lot of Reagan biographies on that show. Yeah. What now? You did one of your other big MTV political scores is that you rode on Bob Dole's campaign bus.
Oh, on the plane, on the bus. Yeah, I was on the.
It was 96 hours to victory.
That's exactly what it was.
And he slept 92 of those hours?
No, he and Elizabeth Dole had the most incredible, vibrant spirits, and they were both very, very gracious. And I found Bob Dole to be very funny and charming, but he invited me on board like it was going to get him something, like, it was going to get him the youth vote. As, you know, the kids across America were going to tune in to CNN and be like, wow, she's with Bob Dole. I'm changing my vote. I think the difference was marginal, but... But I was with the Oak Ridge Boys and Chichi Rodriguez.
Oh, really?
So, you know, I don't want you to think that this was a square
boy,
bus.
Chichi Rodriguez, right? He's Puerto Rico's own. What was the network's reaction when you became known as a Republican?
They were thrilled. Yeah. No, they actually were not. It was interesting because some of my counterparts were off hosting events for Planned Parenthood and various liberal organizations. And I remember I got a lot of grief for, I was given an honorarium to go speak at Phyllis Schlafly's Young Eagles Forum. And, you know, I flew to Washington, D.C., and it was great, but they were really upset about it. So they put a clause in my later contract at MTV that said I was not allowed to engage in any political speech or promotion without written consent from the network. And, you know, written consent from the network could take days. So if I called them the night before and said, Good Morning America wants me to come on tomorrow and give a young conservative rebuttal to the State of the Union address, and, you know, conveniently, there would be no one in the press department to get back to me with the written consent. So, and there was no one else at the network who had that. And I always thought that was really curious.
Right. Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting and that is particularly relevant to this audience is that over time, though, you also realized that you were not actually a Republican or a conservative.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how you came to an understanding that you know, that you were actually libertarian and why you didn't realize it earlier.
Well, it's like thinking that you're a fetishist or a dominatrix, but I didn't like hurting people. I just like wearing leather corsets. And it was a really important distinction for me because I remember having a conversation with the editor, one of the editors from Spin Magazine, and he's like, you know, we talked about various views and what we agreed on, what we disagreed on, and he's like, you're not a social conservative. And that pained me because I really wanted to be on the bus, like I wanted to be a part of a group because I was always such a misfit. And, you know, he was absolutely right. And it was when Kurt Loder took me out for dinner. He took me to Chez Josephine in New York, and Kurt was always very, very gracious. And we were at two completely different worlds at MTV. You know, there was the news department, which, you know, they poured a lot of money into. It was taken very seriously. It was very well regarded within the network, and it established a name for itself outside of the network. And then there was the production side, woo! And, you know, we were the VJs, and we were in the back of Snoop's Hoopty, and, you know, we were just there to look pretty and keep the flow going. And I'll never forget when one of the MTV news producers got in a fight with one of the music producers at the studio because we weren't finished with our stuff, and the news producer's like, you're just leading to videos. And it's like, our leading to videos pays your salary. Like, we're the ones, when we're going down the 7-Eleven Slurpee slide at the beach house, that buys to have the Zorn's Jimmy Choo's.
So Kurt Loder, though.
But Kurt was always so cool to me. He was always really, really kind from the moment I got there, and I was so intimidated by him because he's very smart, he's very dry, he's so funny, but he's a tough nut to crack. And people were genuinely afraid of him because they knew if they said something dumb that he would call them out and just annihilate them. And so I just assumed that he was some lefty New York journalist, and he took me out and he gave me a copy of Ayn Rand's Objectivist Epistemology. And that was my first foray into libertarian ideology and thought. And I honestly didn't know what it meant to be a libertarian. I just knew it, reading about it, it made so much more sense. And then, you know, when you make a diagram of the really confining left-right spectrum, it's so much more complex than that. And it really is so inconsistent and narrow on both sides. And I really felt at the time that both sides were being flung to these extremes. And the more extreme people became in their political thought, the less logical they grew. And the more I learned about libertarianism, the more it seemed to make total sense with what I believed.
Well, talk a little bit about, you know, how have your libertarian beliefs been received, you know, both, you know, at MTV and then beyond? Are they more palatable to a wider range of people, or are they more disturbing to more people?
Well, I think in the late 90s especially, it was really, you're either a conservative or a liberal. You're a Republican or you're a Democrat, and people were very happy to pigeonhole you. And so, you know, there was no ad hoc argument for what people had already defined you as. They would not accept that. So, you know, no one would have entertained a libertarian notion unless I had just left and moved to Montana in a survivalist compound. Right. I think, you know, that might have made them look at things a little bit differently. And I found on the West Coast, it's really great because people are politically engaged in a different way, and there's a different spirit. And I felt like my parents always embodied that, because my parents left the comfort of a corporate law job. My dad's a lawyer in Indianapolis, and wanted to move somewhere beautiful and start a new life, and they didn't have any friends. And my dad got a job in Portland. They had visited there and literally drove the family out in our station wagon. And it always gave me this sense that, you know, life is an adventure, and there's something out there for you to create. You just have to have the spine and the desire to do it.
So would you say that you had always been a libertarian, but you didn't know that there was such a thing?
Yeah, I didn't really, I mean, I didn't have a word for it. I didn't have a frame of reference for the way my beliefs coalesce. And I didn't know that there were other people out there who felt the same way. And it was funny because I was at that Young Eagles event and talking about various things, and the subject of drug legalization came up. And I was like, drugs are bad, okay? And then a college student with a Cato pen came up to me, and he was like, no, actually, there's a really great argument for legalizing drugs. And, you know, my ears sort of pricked up. I said, oh, tell me more, good man, because I just thought that heroin and all these things were so yucky and dirty, smelly people did those drugs.
And you will
which is still true.
You will be selling heroin outside later, right?
Yeah, I've got a kiosk. The hotel has been gracious enough to give me some real estate.
So that helped open up, you know, the idea that there's a third or fourth or fifth position out there.
Yeah.
What you talked a little bit about before about where your beliefs come from. How you know, do you think that libertarian beliefs, is it an impulse that you're born with, or is it something born out of experience, or where does it come from?
It's really funny because people who aren't libertarians, who don't understand it, are so quick to quantify it. And so I've been having this war all week with atheists, lefty atheists on Facebook, because I had the audacity to say on Bill Maher last week that atheism is a religion, and I believe that it is. And I will accept that I'm using that term in a colloquial, intuitive sense, that, you know, it is not epistemologically a religion. But the way that religious people express themselves in this country, really not that different from the way atheists express themselves in this country. And they're more than happy to squash down your beliefs and get very defensive very quickly. And so one guy wrote, libertarianism is just an adolescent fantasy. It's like square wheels on a car. And I was like, no, it's actually not. It's actually the logical progression of an open mind, and if you take it to its fullest, it would actually be the most productive and beneficial.
I was, some of you will remember last year I was on Real Time with Bill Maher as well, and I was happy in the wake of Kennedy's appearance on Twitter. Somebody wrote, Kennedy is the worst guest on Bill Maher since Nick Gillespie. That works for me. So.
Yeah.
Now, you were saying that, you know, partly going also to the idea of experience and a kind of do-it-yourself culture. Your husband, Dave, was a professional, or is a professional snowboarder, and then he came from a kind of like non-political but hippie-ish culture in the Pacific Northwest, but then when he started his own business, he suddenly started getting more interested in libertarian ideas.
Yeah, and he, it's been really interesting watching his progress, and I can't speak for him, but he is so much more enthralled with the political process now, and he's definitely a libertarian because he owns a small business in Southern California. They make snowboards. And it's not that it's a bad place to make snowboards. California's silly with mountains, but it's a really tough place to be in manufacturing. It's a really hostile state to have a manufacturing business and a small business. And so that's what he has found, is that he really wants the government to get out of the way, because they certainly have been no help. I mean, the Small Business Administration, all that nonsense that, you know, and I talked about the figurehead douchebags on Bill Maher, and it doesn't really matter what party, but they all spout these platitudes about that small business is the backbone of this country. It's like, yeah, but you're doing everything you can by raising taxes and forcing people to insure their employees, regardless of whether or not their employees can insure themselves. And it's very unrealistic. It is the only word I can used to describe it is hostile, but he still perseveres. And you know, I talk to a lot of people on talk radio in LA, and whenever the subject comes up about people who own their own businesses, they want to leave. They want to go to Nevada, they want to go to Washington State, where there is a more amenable climate to people who want to live the American dream.
But you also, in previous conversations, you've touched the third rail of libertarian politics, which is parenting.
Yeah.
And you have apparently come up with, you know, a lot of libertarians. And when I started at Reason in 1993, my child was the first person born in the kind of Reason staff orbit in about 10 or 15 years. And it had seemed to be that to be a libertarian, you had to eschew any possibility of reproduction, even if you were a man who had occasional access to women. It seemed to be very anti-children. And you know, but libertarian parenting, I've had more than, and I'm sure everybody in this room has had some kind of conversation where a couple of years ago I met Charles Krauthammer, and you always get these stories of like, I was a libertarian until ... and Krauthammer said, you know, I was a libertarian, which that was the first lie of the conversation. But you know, until I had a daughter. And as if you can't be a parent and a libertarian. But what is your take on libertarian parenting?
Well, my take is, you know, it's from a mom's perspective, and I have two daughters, you know, and I look around, and groupthink starts in preschool. You know, it's not something that happens in college or later. And it's really important for me to teach my girls that, you know, you have to be kind, you have to be inclusive, you have to respect other people, but, you know, don't allow people to bully you. And so much, when you have beliefs that are not held by a vast majority of people, they will try and bully you. They will, because if they don't understand you, they will criticize you. And it's not by trying to bring you into their camp, it's just because you are the other, you are different. And you really have to stand up for yourself. And, you know, I want them to express their individuality. I want them to be autonomous. And I want them to be confident. And, you know, I want them to be able to go out and not feel that they have to spend $900 on a handbag because, you know.
Because that's taking money away from you.
I want to be able to spend $900 on a handbag, but, you know, I want them to.
We should point out that your children are 3 and 6, your daughters, so all of the hard work is still ahead. I look around and I see young women in my neighborhood, and they've got miniskirts and Ugg boots, and which is just, it's a bad look. It's not attractive. You know, I think an aesthetic is really important, and you have to value yourself. But I'm also super into survivalism, and you know, I want my girls to be able to walk home and always have treats and know that they have to have water, and you know, it's like moms are the pocketbook survivalists. By the way, it's like all we see on Discovery Channel is these hulking men in hemp vests, you know, out there fashioning rafts out of snake skin. But it's like, moms are the real survivalists. And I realize this the more and more as we go along, because if you ask any woman to empty out her purse right now, she would be able to keep most of the room alive in breath mints and lip gloss for 2 weeks. But moms can MacGyver their way out of just about anything. Sure. Now, you told me once that you were, this was some years ago, before your rise to, what, you were on MTV? I'm forgetting now for a second. But your first internship in LA, you were denied after you were accepted because you were a Republican. This was, would that happen now, or do you think, is libertarianism on the rise among younger people or among older people, or does it seem to you to have, you know, over the past 20 years, is it more of a recognizable position, and if so, Why is that? Is it a good thing?
It's
How
much
do we make
more
it
of a recognizable position. And I think part of that is due to the economy and people realizing that the right-left paradigm isn't going to bring back jobs. It's not going to get the economy going, and certainly not big government. We've seen so many big government administrations, one after the other, and it just doesn't work. So finally, people are doing a couple things. They're going issue by issue because that's just the way people are informing themselves, and I think that's a really good advent of talk radio. And talk radio really takes a drubbing. What it allows people to do is learn about things, because Adrian Moore was on my radio show, and we talked about high-speed rail and how ridiculous it is, and how Californians, and I don't understand this, they approved this bond measure for $9 million, and now the cost is going to be $90 billion. And did you really think the math was going to add up, number one? And in a state where we are just screwed, blued, and tattooed in every imaginable sense, we really need to be spending $99 billion on high-speed rail with all the problems we got? I mean, we got 99 problems. And they say, well,
yeah. Okay. So, well, why don't we open it up for some questions, and let's.
And Ron Paul also has.
Wait, 99 billion for Ron Paul?
No, he's not a problem. But Ron Paul, like my mom and I, this is a really good example. My mom is an avowed Democrat. She will volunteer for every Democratic candidate. She works the polls. She's all over the place. And, she loved Bill Clinton. My grandmother, God rest her soul, but she had a signed picture of Bill Clinton in her house. And she's like, oh, that Monica Lewinsky, she is such a slut. What she did to him, it's awful. And I'm thinking like, Mima, how much did you have to pay for that picture? Like, how many Social Security checks did it take for her to afford that? But
But now your mother
so my
is
mom,
a Ron Paul
yeah, my
fan.
mom is the super. But we agree on a lot of Ron Paul stuff, because my mom hates corporations, and she doesn't like wars, and she doesn't like big government. So this Ron Paul character is really starting to sound like a rational approach to these modern political crises.
All right. Well, thank you, Kennedy. Let's have some questions.
Thanks very much. That was great, both of you. Now that Dan Quayle is a card-carrying member of the AARP, who is your current crush on, or more seriously?
I'm so glad you asked. That's a very valid question, and the answer is Mitt Romney's sons.
So you want them to be your brother wives?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So turnabout is fair play.
Are there political figures out there that you admire who you'd like to see go places?
I really do like Gary Johnson, and I was fortunate enough to meet Governor Johnson at a Reason event, and I have so much respect for what he's done in New Mexico, and I was surprised how he was marginalized in the Republican debates. And Gary and I are both triathletes, and we both have celiac disease. So there's not just the legalizing marijuana.
So it's the narcissism that draws you closer to just like you.
Nick, you say that, but my humility is probably my greatest attribute.